Welcome to Robertson 3 with me. My name's Meggie. I like to start off by asking you a couple of questions because I want to know a little bit about you all right now. So raise your hand if you love Python. Perfect. Raise your hand if you love PyBay. Raise your hand if you're going to come to PyBay next year. Awesome. Raise your hand if you've made a web application. Awesome. Raise your hand if you've made a Django web application. Great. Raise your hand if you've done the Django tutorial. Okay, great. We're doing good. All right, and that's okay for those of you who haven't. I'm totally fine with that. I will try to make this as useful as possible for you all. I think I had one more. Raise your hand if you like. Okay, perfect. We've got a solid quorum on that front. All right, so really quickly, an introduction. I'm going to cover a couple of things. First off, just really briefly, why class-based views? You could write a whole book on this, and I'm sure someone has, but I'm just going to cover it really briefly. And then we're going to talk about a couple of the class-based views that I think you should know if you're going to get started doing this. Those are TemplateView, ListView, and DetailView. By no means an exhaustive list, but still very solid chunk core knowledge. If you get that far, you're doing pretty well in class-based view land. And then we'll look at a custom Mixin that I created to prove to myself that I could, because I often Google like why class-based views. I did that even like before. I think mostly to convince myself that I should learn them when I had to for work, and I was very dismayed to find that it's a little bit more structured than I usually would have liked when I was writing web apps at first, and so I would prove to myself this is useful, and there was one thing that I read online that someone said that I wanted to debunk. And I'll talk more about that later. And then some tips and resources. So this is like the slide to come back to next week, next month, in December, over Christmas break, when you're like, oh yeah, class-based views. So you'll have that. So some assumptions that I'm making when I talk about this stuff: you've created a dynamic web application. If you haven't, that's okay. I think you can still learn a lot, but just know that I'll kind of be speaking in that manner. And then also that you've created your own objects in Python. So I didn't ask this actually. Raise your hand if you've created your own objects in Python. Awesome. Great. So instance attributes, methods, you're cool with that. Awesome. Thumbs up. And then the other piece is just that not so much you've done every single part of the tutorial or that you've deployed a Django app, but this is a structure that I hope looks somewhat familiar. So this is kind of what a Django project looks like. There's a couple of important things to note. There's a urls.py. I'll be showing this a couple of times. It just contains kind of like what you see in the browser and then what view that points at. So it's a little different from other web frameworks that you may have worked with. And then models are your database models. Those are classes. Those are pretty much always classes, so that shouldn't be surprising. And then views, we're going to look at a lot of views. So that's the file that we're going to keep looking back at again and again. And so that's kind of what it looks like. Goats, that's not a Django thing. You might know what's coming up. And it is a Goat-based web application. So. A little bit of disambiguation first, lots of prep knowledge here. But when I was first learning about class-based views, I wasn't really sure what they were at all, like at a high level, because I kept seeing different things. So one of the things that people might be talking about when they say, oh yeah, we use class-based views, is that they use the generic Django class-based views. And these are for sort of like common CRUD type tasks, create, update, delete, or create, update, destroy, and other interesting types of views. So Django has these like really beautiful classes, and we'll look at the internals of those in a second. And you might also be using some of like Django's Mixins, which are really nice. If you're using class-based views, you can also use, you can just skip generic views entirely and just use the Mixins, which are nice for things like permissions and whatnot. And then custom views that you create, you might not even use any of the generic views. You might just be making a class, which is a view. And it has nothing to do with kind of the nice Django kind of boilerplate awesomeness, which I recommend you use. But if you just want to make views, you can. Django provides just this base view class, which we'll look at in a second as well. And if you do that, even outside of the generic views, you could do something like this, like make a class called random goat fact mixin, and that just puts a goat fact and the logic for getting a random goat fact on every single one of your views, so that on every page of your web application there can be a random goat fact. I didn't build that, unfortunately. I wish I had. And then you can also, and this is what I really wanted to talk about today, but it like did not happen at all. I have so much more to talk about than this. But this is a really interesting thing, non-generic hierarchical views. So nothing about the generic views. It's literally just using the wonderful hierarchy of object orientation to make your views more dry, so to speak. And I won't really show that, but I think it's cool, so I thought I'd mention it. So we have lots of choices when we're learning about class-based views. So I'll cover kind of the most important top-level things that I'm excited about. Maybe I'll do another talk another time on the other stuff. All right, so why class-based views? Very briefly. First off, what is a view? A user did a thing and wants to see a thing, right? That's the most common view. That's why it's called view, the act of viewing, right? It makes total sense. And then things get more complicated when you add JavaScript and dynamic web pages. So it might be JavaScript wants to see a thing so that it can show the user the thing, or it might be something even more internal and abstracted from the actual user. But it's a subset of kind of a web page in some form. But it's the logic behind that. But you all know that. So here's what a view would return. This is the ultimate sort of end point of the view. It's the response. And in this case, we're just seeing some HTML here. Goat Hub. It's like Pinterest for goats. It's not version control for goats. I really wish that I built that, but I didn't. So that's fine. All right, so if you've done the Django tutorial, I think it's step 2. How many of you got to step 2, part 2? Awesome. Okay, so then this should look pretty familiar to you. Also, if you've done Flask ever, this should be very, very awesome and recognizable. This is what makes learning how to build web applications a little easier, is like you have a function. It takes in a request from the user, right? I want to see this page, I want to submit this form, and it returns a response, right? Functions are one of the first things that you learn when you're learning a program. You map that idea to a web request, and you're in business. Very straightforward, very tactile and tangible. And then with Django, you just kind of map that function to a URL, and it gets called when that request comes in. Lovely. I love function-based views. They're easy to get started. They plug nicely into Django's APIs. You can do pretty much everything that you can do with a class-based view with a function-based view. Then why am I here talking to you today? So functions kind of only have one trick about them. They only have one way to express sort of dynamic ideas, one interface, if you will. Anyone want to guess what the interface to a function is? Calling it, yes, and the parameters that you pass in when you do that. So here's kind of an extreme example of a function that could do with a little more expressiveness. So this is just one function. It is a view function for a Django app from Zula. And this kind of, all this stuff that's going out of the box that I made for it is sort of the stuff that's changing every time you call that function. And it's all kind of on the same level, right? You would really have to dig into the code to figure out All right, I think I know what the request is, but what is this locally echoed, and what's rendered context disparity, and what's this all caps REQ, right? There's a lot of meaning here, but it's not immediately obvious, right? It doesn't have a whole lot of structure. It's just kind of parameters, like know how to pass them in, know what they do, and know what side effects they cause. And so it's almost like I don't know, like something that could be expressed with a poem trying to be expressed with like very dense technical speak, right? Like there's probably a more elegant and efficient way to communicate this idea of what's going on with this view. So, because that wasn't code that I wrote, I wanted to show you code that I wrote that also has that same problem, because that's mean to do otherwise. But this is from when I was first learning Python in 2013, and I was looking at it last night, and I was just like, oh, that's cute. I like it, though. It's nice. But there's a lot going on here. I'm not quite sure, what's unique to the view, what's not, and it worked. I can tell you that much. That I was very invested in at the time. But is it clear, maintainable? Could I fix a bug in it very quickly? Probably not. So why class-based views? They hide complexity. Yay! Even more than what a function hides, which is nice. Each view should express the essential features of only that view. So if there's something that's common or generic about that view, like it shows you goats, right? That should not be shown to me. That should be encapsulated somewhere else on another view, which is common to all goat-related things in my app. And then views that are, this is a little more subtle. Views that are similar but different should still behave similarly. And this is like, you can say that out loud over and over and kind of try to start to understand what that might look like in a web application. But basically, like, you should be able to tell what template a view returns, regardless of what view you're looking at. They all have this same behavior. So they should all do it the same way. Does that kind of make sense? Do you kind of feel like this guy right now? Okay. I want that, yeah. All right, so let's start simple. There's this simple, just bare bones, class-based view. So we'll start here with that function-based view that we looked at, takes in a request, returns a response, goat/homepage.html is a template. We can very quickly turn that into a class-based view, like so. I didn't put my import statement up here, but basically we're importing something called generic from Django. And we've defined a homepage view as a class. And we gave it a template name attribute. Now, this is the part where I was like, I hate class-based views. This is horrible. And I can tell you why. Because I couldn't see where the response was going to get returned. Like, at what point do we actually give a response? I don't see that. I'm angry that I don't see. I was angry when I didn't see that. But that's actually a nice thing. That will get taken care of for us. We can assume that that will go down at the time that it needs to in the correct format for what it is. Maybe that feels wrong to you. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it feels right. At the time, I did not like that at all, because I was like, what's going on? But it works. It's awesome. And oops, sorry. Hey, dude. And why does it work? Because we have all of these kind of ancestors of template view. So template view is a class in Django, and it inherits from something called the template response Mixin, which is basically a class that's like, I know how to make a response using a given template. And pretty much all class-based views inherit from this in some way. And then you have content Mixin, which is, I can make a dictionary that will get passed to a template. Cool. And then you have something called the view ancestor. And that's basically, I can be assigned a URL in a Django app and accept certain HTTP methods as defined by the view. So all the things that are common sort of have been hidden from us, and we like that. This is kind of another version of that, if that helps. So here's an open source example of this, just to come full circle on Zulip. We love Zulip. Zulip's awesome. I would be humbled to be a contributor, maybe someday. But Zulip has a template view in their corporate URLs. And interestingly, they're not even defining the template view anywhere. They're just getting template view from Django and then immediately kind of passing it in the way that it needs to be passed in to the URL and changing one attribute at the time that that happens. So it's even shorter, even pithier version of that. They didn't even put that there. They were just like, screw it, we're just going to instantiate it at the time that it needs to be. It's not really instantiating, but everybody see that? Capital T, template, capital V view. All right, so that's cool. Template view, okay. We're good, right? Like, we can make one class-based view. It's okay. We don't see where it returns the response, but that's cool. All right, let's keep going. We're going to see some goats in a second. All right, so the list view. The list view is kind of one level up from the template view. We see many list views. This could be considered a list view. Facebook doesn't use Django, but if they did, maybe they would make a list, use the list view for this page, which is my news feed. And I did write, I'm putting this in my talk tomorrow because it's legitimately relevant on the post. I logged into Facebook for the first time in a while. Oops, sorry. Okay. This is also a list view of sorts. It's Pinterest. It's a bunch of database objects, right, on a page. That's basically what a list view is. Questions on what, or sorry, I'm supposed to save questions for the end. If you have questions on list view, let me know. All right, so list view. Let's just recall. Each view, because we're about to see something crazy, each view should express the essential features of only that view, not what's generic about that view. So when you use ListView in Django, it would look something like this. This is kind of the simplest ListView. This is the minimum that you would possibly need to provide to render a bunch of database objects onto a page in Django. If you have a view that's at the top that inherits from generic.listView, all you have to specify is what database model you care about, and what, you don't even have to say this actually, but I put the template name, but you can get Django to figure that out for you as well. And then you just kind of stick this in urls.py, similar to function-based views. And really quick, I do have a goat model in my database, so there's a goat table somewhere with goats in it, and I'd like to render those goats. A goat can belong to a user, it can have a name, it can have a photo, and a description. And there it is. It's the goat list, everyone. And just with, I think it was like 4 lines of code, I just have a list of goats. Well, that's cool. And I could easily, this is a toy app, like it's not, a production level app, but the point is that when you're building a web app like this that depends on a database, pages just proliferate, right? Suddenly you have a list view, and then you have like a filtered list view, but then you have a list view that needs a different format because it's for users who like Pinterest, and then you have a list view which shows all the goats whose names are Billy because it's a special, Billy goat page. So you have all these pages, right? And there's this core logic in Django that just knows how to render goat objects, which is awesome. So very, very straightforward. And here's another way to imagine the goat list view. Let's say, how websites don't really have this as much nowadays, but I really liked it. They'll have like 2 different ways to view the page, right? Like, I want to see it in like Zen mode or like not Zen mode or whatever, or list view mode and Pinterest mode, right? And so, if I were building this when I was first starting out, I probably would have made like 2 straight up, like full-on views that did the exact same database query, that had the exact same logic, the same template with the exception of like a class or two, and it would be very repetitive and not immediately clear that these two views do the same thing. Or you could write it with an if statement, like in the function, like if the request.args has format equals Pinterest in it, show this template, otherwise show this template, which is fine. But we can accomplish this. And this is like the meat and potatoes of using generic views. Not get template names specifically, but overriding a method that's provided on the generic parent. This one's called get template names. I wonder what it does. Get template. Oh, it gets the template names. Hey, okay. So this is what Django will call when it has to figure out which template to show. And I think what's really important, I wish someone had told me this when I was first learning class-based views. It's in the doc, so I really can't blame anyone. But if you have this instance of the view, right? You're inside a method, you have self, and then you have a request object, which represents at the time that user tried to render that page, what args were present, were they submitting a form, when did it, everything that's in HTTP request headers, you have access to just for freezies, like it's all there. You just have to access it. And so we just access it and we say, did they provide a query arg which is format equals Pinterest? And they did. And so we rendered a different template. But there are lots of methods like this, which Django calls when it wants to, and we don't get to call them ourselves, and that's weird. And, I was like, am I gonna have to memorize the order in which all the methods get called because that's relevant to my life now? No, it's all good. It's gonna work. It's gonna be great. The methods are very helpfully named, and the docs are amazing, and I had to actively prevent myself from like screenshotting the docs and showing you all, but I know that you all know where to find them, so that's that. ListView has some cool other ancestors that differ, that are in addition to sort of the template view ancestors that we saw earlier. So it inherits from the multiple object template response Mixin, and as a result, also the template response Mixin, which is basically, I know how to make a response using a given template, and if I have a default name for the template, I messed that up, but you see where I'm going with that. The base list view is kind of the thing that pulls a bunch of different things together. I'm a view with multiple objects. And part of what the base list view inherits from is the multiple object Mixin, which is give me the name of a database table and query it appropriately for your view and put the results into the template you specify, which came from another ancestor, interestingly. And then you have the view class, which we saw earlier. Cool? Here's the diagram. Thanks, classy class-based views. And that's that. That's all that a list view is. It's just a compendium of other classes and mixins. Here's an open source example. It's from an app called Django Timepiece. Open source, very cool for keeping track, I think, of like how long you spend on different things when you're programming. And nothing really to note here. This is showing off another one of those methods that you can override. So if you wanted to say, don't just get all the goats out of the database, but get the goats and order them by something, right? Always. Then you can do that. And Django will call that function to figure out what objects to put in the template. Okay, and you have to wait for this one. Did you see it? No? Okay, look again. It's very human-like. Wait. That's it, okay. So that's ListView. All right, this is the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, the mysterious thing that I wanted to debunk for myself. So, and to introduce it, we have to talk about DetailView, which is a good thing to talk about. DetailView is like the more specific list view. Instead of showing a group of objects, it shows a single object. And just like the generic views that we've seen, it's pretty straightforward to just plug right into that, get a detail view in what? 4 lines of code. Amazing. So this is the detail view, and that's Connie. She appreciates the little things in life and lives in Nebraska. I don't know if you can read that. So this is a detail view. That's all we had to write. We did, map the URL to the detail view, and the URL takes in sort of like a primary key argument, but Django knows how to deal with that. Django's just like, cool, primary key, that's what I'll use to get the object out of the database because I'm a detail view and I do things like that. So pretty cool. This is Homer, that's another detail view. They look the same, right? This is the same code, the same template, just a different primary key in the URL of this detail view. All right, so here's the thing. I wanted to prove to myself, because I think when you're learning class-based views, you think, wow, this is so great. I can make a detail view, there's a create view, there's a list view, there's a update view, right? All the views that I want. And then you think, okay, I also want to put, comments on my detail view. And then the world stops. And you're like, there's no generic class called detail view with create view for another model, right? There's no default thing that's called that. And so there's no secondary way to sort of just plug right in and just say, well, I care about the detail for the goat and the create view for the comment, because I want to be able to comment on a detail view. And so I was really stumped with this for a while. And some people, mostly on Stack Overflow, were like, well, I use class-based views mostly because they're good for just like straightforward database things, but anytime that I have to do something more complicated than that, I definitely use a function-based view. And that really worried me. I was like, oh my God, really? Like this is all that you can use? That's it? You can't build like a straightforward page like this with a class-based view? That's ridiculous. But it turns out you totally can. Like that's where class-based views really start to shine. That's where the really interesting things come in, is when you actually have a bunch of components on the page, and they all talk to different database models, and you need to make that maintainable, elegant code. And so the way that, and that's another one, and Homer has some comments down there. So it not only has this create functionality, but it also shows almost like a list view for comments, right? And this is all class-based views. So I didn't like cheat and use like part of a class-based view and then a function-based view. It's all class-based. So here it is. Oh, no, this is not it. This is the model. Just so you know, I made a comment table, and it's pretty straightforward. It just belongs to a user associated with a goat, has a comment field. And I also had to make a form. So raise your hand if you've used forms in Django before. Okay. So forms, similar to views, are just as elegant and awesome. They plug right into a database table. You can basically define this class and call a certain method, HTML for a create comment, auto-generated. That's all it does. It's not mapped to a URL or anything. It just looks at the database and says, okay, you have these fields, and here's how I could validate them, because I know their data types, and you just define it just like this. And then, this is like completely me. I'm sure there's a even more Django way to do this, but this is, I fretted over this for several weeks. I was like, I'm gonna do this, it's gonna be great. I started off doing something completely different, and then I arrived at this, and it's essentially a comment create form Mixin. And note, it doesn't inherit from anything from Django. Interesting, so it's just an object. But I'm defining this method called post, and post, as it turns out, is a method that is on a generic Django class. I think it's on View. And so that method is something that Django looks for and calls when it receives a post request on a particular view. So if I didn't use this as a mix-in, like Nothing magical would occur. It's just that if I define a method and I override that method on the Mixin, it will also get overridden on the child. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've got post. That's going to actually handle, thank you, that's going to handle the creation of the comment, so when the form gets submitted. And then we have something called get context data. Raise your hand if you use Flask in here. Okay, cool. So get context data is a lot like render template in Flask, kind of. It's basically figure out what I should have access to into the template. And so if get context data should return a dictionary of just key value pairs of what I should be able to talk about in the HTML. That's all it is. It sounds much more complicated than it actually is. It's just like, I want to be able to talk about the goat in the template, return a dictionary with the key of goat and the value of goat object. And so in the template, I want to be able to have access to a create comment form. So I instantiate create comment form and I put it in the context. And I'm not going to show the template here, but basically I just render the form in the template. Very straightforward. All classes, and then I just, use that Mixin on my Goat DetailView, and it gets added to the context. I render it in the template, all as well. So it's pretty cool, and you can do that with like anything that you can think of. And that's a goat jumping on a trampoline. All right, so in conclusion, tips on learning class-based views. Try all the generic views, just do them all. In fact, I still haven't done kind of like some of the date time ones, which I'm really excited to explore soon. But they all have like interesting, fun things that you can override and just experiment with those. It's very well documented and straightforward. If you're ever lost, you can know Django will call any of those methods that you're overriding. So if you're not sure like what they're for or what they do or what they get passed, you can just import PDB set trace, and look around. Just print stuff out. Just be like, okay, what's self here? Oh yeah, it's the instance of the view. Of course it is. I'm in a view, right? Like there's plenty of exploring to be done inside of each of these functions. There's lots of cool arguments that get passed in and ways that the request gets unpacked in interesting ways. So do that. And this is kind of like the next level part. When I started feeling not so lost with class-based views, I was like, cool, I can just do whatever I want. And you shouldn't do that, because you lose out on some of the cool Django stuff when you sort of just take the function-based approach of like, no, I'm just going to do everything by hand myself. So when you're doing something in Django, after you've gotten a little more familiar with class-based views, look for the correct way to do something. And like, take that as like a challenge. It's not an annoyance, right? There's probably the best possible way to do something. And if you do that, you'll learn, your code will be safer, more secure, more maintainable, because Django just has all these wonderful built-in sort of checks and elegance. So look for the right way. It takes longer at first. That can be hard. But it will teach you things about Python, about Django, about yourself. Wow, that got corny. Okay. The resources page. So some of these things are kind of like Django braces and Django model utils are just things that make they provide extra class-based views. They provide things that make using class-based views easier. So I really recommend installing both of those on your Django projects. 2 Scoops of Django is the single most awesome, illuminating, more intermediate book on just like best practices, and it will help you do the right thing. And then this site, Classy Class-Based Views, that's where it all got started for me. It's this wonderful British site maintained by some British company. What is it? Luke Plant, is that the guy's name? Okay, I was trying to find it. Well, he works at some company in the UK, and it just shows the MRO, the method resolution order for each of the class-based views. It's very straightforward. It's like you could build it yourself, but just having it all there for each class-based view, you're like, okay, here are my options. This is what I could override if I wanted to. Would I know exactly what I was doing? Maybe not. But I could technically override every single one of those things. And then it has those little like diagrams too. So just a quick special thanks to Joel Burton, who made me learn ClassBased Views and explained lots of the things to me. And then Hackbright for sending me here to speak and getting my staff in here to finally learn, hopefully, how to build a new feature in our internal tool. Now you have no excuse. And thank you to Goats Everywhere, who I definitely, couldn't have done this without them. And I did put all of my Goat Hub on GitHub, so you can check out my GitHub for that. And then my slides, I tweeted the URL to my personal website on my Twitter account. So if you want the slides, you can just like look on my Twitter and then click the link. And then you can email me if you want, if you have additional questions. And if you like teaching Python, talk to me. We're hiring instructors. I teach at a software engineering boot camp in the city in Union Square called Hackbright. We teach women how to be software engineers, and they go get jobs and be awesome. So that's that. Thank you.
Awesome. I think we have some time for a few questions. So if you just raise your hand, we can bring the microphone around.
This is totally a beginner question because I have lots of legacy Django stuff and have never really gotten on the CBV train. Oh. The as view thing, why can't I just pass the class or call the class to get an instance? Like, what's up with as view? Why is that necessary?
Yeah, so I was just talking about this right before the talk, and I was like this close to going and reading the source code, but I'm really glad that you asked that because that will always make me follow my intuition. But I remember reading something a couple months back that was really interesting about as view. Essentially, it returns like some kind of class or function that Django then uses to actually instantiate your view and kind of do all of the processing. I'm not quite sure why it doesn't just use your own class, but I do recall reading something, and I'm going to fact check myself like right after this, which was that Django under the hood doesn't actually even use classes. Like, even though Django loves people to use class-based views and like has been porting a lot of their built-in APIs to class-based views, it actually uses function-based views at the bottom of everything. And so class-based views are not more efficient or more wonderful, like good for your web application necessarily. They just make code more maintainable. So it's kind of interesting, but yeah, that's about all I know about that. Kind of interesting. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've neither used Flask nor Django, and if I were to start using something, what would you recommend?
I think you could. So we teach Flask at Hackbright, and I love Flask. It was my first web framework. I think it's perfect when you're first starting out. It's so straightforward, and it forces you to ask some of the hard questions. I think you could probably have a similar experience if you just focused on function-based views in Django. But I'd love Django, but I might recommend Flask a little bit more if you're just starting out with that, especially if it's the first web application that you're creating. Because Django just has the installation and like the project structure is a lot more boilerplate, like what's this doing? And then you lose 2 hours of your day just trying to figure out what it's doing, and it's not actually important. So yeah, Flask. Yeah. Yep. Other questions? I ended right on time.
Perfect. Awesome. So I think another round of applause.